Humanity is running the largest monetary trial ever attempted, and most people have no idea they are participants. Worldwide debt, governmental, corporate, household, and financial, has surged beyond anything previous societies sustained. States borrowed trillions with routine votes. Central banks create currency with a click. Families sign decades-long loans as casually as weekly shopping. Still, we speak as if debt is ordinary, safe, and everlasting. The reality is darker. Obligations have always functioned as authority, leverage, and a delayed detonator awaiting pressure. The critical issue is not whether today's debt mountain will trigger turmoil, but when the strain breaks, and who absorbs the losses when the system is forced to reset. History shows such experiments end abruptly, reshaping politics, wealth, and daily life, while explanations arrive only after damage is irreversible globally. To understand the present, we have to trace debt back to its origins. Debt did not begin as an abstract financial concept. It emerged alongside organized society itself. The earliest written records humanity produced were not myths or laws, but accounting marks pressed into clay. In Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, debt meant grain owed after harvest, animals promised for labor, or silver due. At a later date, these obligations structured daily life. More importantly, they were enforced by authority. Temples and palaces stood at the center of early economies, tracking debts, collecting them, and deciding when they could no longer be sustained. In those ancient systems, debt was inseparable from power. Kings and priests understood that obligations could stabilize society, but only up to a point. When too many farmers fell into arrears, fields went uncultivated, soldiers deserted, and social order fractured. That is why periodic debt cancellations jubilees were not acts of charity, but acts of survival. Wiping the slate clean restored balance and prevented permanent servitude. The lesson was clear. Debt could organize civilization, but unchecked debt could destroy it. As societies grew more complex, debt evolved. By the medieval and Renaissance periods, obligations were no longer measured in grain or cattle, but in coin, gold, and credit. Banking families rose to prominence by financing rulers who could not fund their ambitions through taxes alone. Wars, monuments, and empires were built on borrowed money. Florence's bankers, Venice's, Lendo's, and Genoa's financiers transformed debt into a sophisticated instrument, extending credit across borders and generations. Yet the risks remained unchanged. Spain offers one of history's clearest warnings. Flooded with silver from the Americas, the Spanish crown appeared unimaginably wealthy. In reality, that wealth encouraged reckless borrowing. Future treasure was pledged to pay present bills, and when revenues fell short, defaults followed. Spain declared bankruptcy repeatedly, despite commanding vast resources. The implication was unmistakable. Access to wealth does not eliminate the dangers of debt. It often amplifies them. By the 20th century, debt had become a central force in global politics. The First World War shattered old financial limits. Governments borrowed on an unprecedented scale, assuming victory and growth would make repayment manageable. Instead, the aftermath produced crushing obligations. Germany's reparations under the Treaty of Versailles were so severe that economists warned they would destabilize the nation. The warnings were ignored. What followed was hyperinflation so extreme that money ceased to function as a store of value. Savings evaporated. Trust collapsed. Political extremism flourished in the vacuum. This period revealed a critical truth. Debt crises are never contained within balance sheets. They spill into society, shaping elections, radicalizing populations, and altering history itself. Debt was not merely an economic inconvenience. It was a catalyst for upheaval. After the Second World War, leaders sought to prevent a repeat of that chaos. The Bretton Woods system was designed to impose order on global finance. Currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. Stability was the promise. Discipline was the requirement. For a time, the system worked because the constraints were real. Debt expanded but within boundaries, enforced by tangible limits. Those limits, however, proved politically inconvenient. As spending pressures mounted, restraint gave way to when the link to gold was severed in the early 1970s, debt entered a new phase. It was no longer anchored to scarcity. It became elastic, expandable, and increasingly abstract. That shift did not eliminate risk, it postponed it. The consequences would arrive later, magnified by scale, hidden beneath layers of complexity, and deferred to future generations who never consented to the experiment. With the gold standard abandoned, governments and central banks discovered a newfound freedom, the ability to borrow and spend with few visible constraints. Interest rates became tools to steer economies, and debt itself became an instrument of policy rather than a limitation. In periods of stagnation, borrowing was encouraged. In moments of crises, additional debt patched shortfalls. Each rescue, however, required more leverage than the last, and the accumulation of obligations grew faster than most could imagine. By the 1980s, public debt in advanced economies had reached levels that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher justified these expansions as necessary for defense and reform. Meanwhile, developing nations borrowed heavily from Western institutions, setting the stage for widespread defaults when repayment proved impossible. The Latin American debt crisis illustrates the pattern vividly. Countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina assumed loans to fund growth and infrastructure, often denominated in foreign currencies. When interest rates rose or commodity prices fell, these nations could not honor their commitments. Economic collapse followed, prompting international bailouts and restructuring. The lesson was consistent. Debt could be used to chase prosperity, but when circumstances shifted, the burden became unmanageable. The 2008 financial crisis represents the modern apex of this dynamic. It was not a simple housing problem. Rather, it was a systemic failure, the culmination of debt layered upon debt, amplified by leverage ratios. Mortgages were bundled into securities, insured with derivatives, and sold worldwide. When a single sector faltered, the collapse propagated through the global system, devastating banks, wiping out pensions, and forcing governments to intervene with trillions in bailouts. Ordinary citizens, who had no role in creating this structure, bore the consequences through foreclosures, unemployment, and austerity measures. Debt revealed itself as a mechanism favoring the powerful, protecting lenders while exposing the vulnerable. Since 2008, global debt has escalated at an astonishing pace. By 2023, total obligations reached more than $300 trillion, almost 4 times the size of the global economy. Nations, corporations, and households all contributed to this growth. Japan's public debt exceeds 200% of GDP. The United States continues to borrow trillions annually, with minimal public debate. Emerging economies, often reliant on foreign currency loans, risk sudden collapse when rates rise. The system has become a delicate balancing act, maintained by the assumption that debt can grow indefinitely without consequences. Yet history demonstrates otherwise. Debt distorts behavior, creates speculative bubbles, concentrates wealth, and shifts risk onto future generations. Every dollar borrowed today represents a claim on tomorrow's labor. When obligations become too large to service, default or inflation becomes inevitable. Governments may inflate away debts, restructure them, or refuse repayment entirely. These mechanisms are never painless. Citizens bear the cost, while political and financial elites often escape unscathed. The lesson is clear. Leverage is not neutral. It is a force multiplier, and it always exacts a price. At an individual level, debt has become largely invisible yet profoundly impactful. Governments issue bonds quietly. Banks provide credit seamlessly, and corporations report profits inflated by borrowed capital. The financial system operates on promises whose fulfillment is never guaranteed. In the United States alone, the national debt exceeded $34 trillion in 2024, translating to hundreds of thousands in obligations per taxpayer. Interest payments rival defense budgets, meaning borrowing is often used just to pay interest on existing debt. Across Europe and Asia, similar dynamics apply, creating a network of interconnected liabilities that magnify the risk of systemic collapse. The psychology of debt is as important as its mathematics. Politicians and policymakers favor borrowing because it defers difficult choices. Raising taxes is unpopular. Cutting spending provokes outrage. Debt offers a temporary illusion of ease, shifting responsibility to future generations. The danger lies in that illusion While obligations appear manageable today, small shifts in interest rates or economic growth can make them suddenly unbearable. Since 2022, central banks worldwide have increased rates to curb inflation, exposing the fragility of debt-laden governments, households, and corporations. Mortgage payments, refinancing costs, and government obligations all surged, revealing that debt behaves like a dormant predator, harmless until awakened. Society continues to treat debt as a pathway to opportunity, ignoring its hidden risks. Students are encouraged to borrow tens of thousands for education without certainty of returns. Families are urged to stretch for homes under the assumption that real estate values will always rise. Governments operate under the belief that deficits are inconsequential because currency can be printed at will. This belief is a dangerous fiction. Debt is neither free nor infinite, and its accumulation inevitably produces consequences. Economic history repeatedly demonstrates the limits of borrowing, whether through inflation, restructuring, or default. Inflation is often the preferred method to manage excessive debt. By reducing the real value of obligations, governments transfer part of the cost to citizens silently. Prices rise, purchasing power falls, and obligations shrink proportionally. Restructuring, on the other hand, requires negotiating reductions in debt obligations, often forcing lenders to accept losses, as seen in Greece during the Eurozone crisis. Default represents the most extreme scenario, where repayment is refused entirely. Each pathway imposes costs and disruption, and none can fully escape historical precedent. The stakes extend beyond economics. Debt is an instrument of power. It determines who receives relief, who bears losses, and who profits when systems fail. When governments and corporations face insolvency, the powerful are often insulated, while ordinary people experience the consequences directly. Homes are lost, jobs vanish, and savings evaporate. Understanding debt, therefore, is not just financial literacy, it is survival. Awareness enables individuals to recognize the system's traps and respond with informed choices rather than passive acceptance. To navigate this reality, 3 principles are essential. First, strip away illusions. Debt carries consequences, and no promise of repayment is ever risk-free. Second, study the patterns of history. No nation, empire, or financial system has escaped reckoning with excessive obligations. Understanding these cycles provides perspective and clarity. Third, protect yourself. This does not require panic or irrational hoarding of wealth. Instead, prioritize assets resilient to cyclical fluctuations. Acquire knowledge that clarifies risk, and cultivate perspective to avoid repeating historical mistakes. The system will continue repeating familiar patterns. Debt accumulates, leaders deny, crises erupt, and societies reset. Your choice is whether to navigate these cycles consciously or to bear their consequences unwittingly. The patterns of history are unmistakable. Debt grows, leaders ignore warnings, crises erupt, and societies are forced to reset. Your choice is whether to navigate this cycle with awareness or remain blind to its dangers. Recognize the mechanisms, and you can avoid becoming collateral damage. Ignore them, and you will bear the cost of failures you never caused. Global debt is not merely an abstract figure. It is a looming force shaping the future. If we fail to understand it, we will suffer as previous empires have. If this perspective opened your eyes, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to find them.